Have you ever said something but then immediately recognized that you could have used a better word? How often does that happen to you? For me, personally, not only does it happen often, but I overthink it quite a bit too. I'm fairly pedantic in regard to the words I pick. And although I don't think people should overthink it across the board, I do believe we could all think about the words we use just a bit more. So my aim is that once you finish this video, you'll also be paying granular attention to the way you articulate your thoughts moving forward. Chapter 1. Definitions and True Synonyms. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine whenever someone uses a synonym when it's not exactly warranted. Superficially, it might seem like synonyms are supposed to portray the same meaning as a given word, but usually, if not technically always, there's a nuance to the synonym you used, making it more appropriate for a certain context. Otherwise, why would a synonym even be invented? Most linguists agree that true synonymity, that is two words being quite literally the same short of their spelling and pronunciation, doesn't actually exist, because you can always mark a difference, be it in meaning, only partially the same, connotation, they seem to suggest different things, historical roots, or maybe just different usage. Let's take a look at one of my favorite examples, considerable and significant. At face value, these two words are more or less interchangeable. You won't get any weird looks or remarks for going with one over the other, yet they are indeed distinct. One of the differences is that significant is more about abstract prominence, while considerable is usually used for discussing empirical phenomena, like distance or weight. She is of considerable weight, his achievements are significant. There's also a more subtle difference, and it lies in the origins of the words themselves. Significant comes from the Latin significare, which more or less means to make known, and over time it started indicating momentousness. Considerable, on the other hand, comes from considerare, which expectedly means to consider, like something is worth a deliberation and thought. Therefore, pedantically, if someone were to say it was considerable versus it was significant, whatever they refer to the second time around technically denotes something of more overall significance compared to the first time, where it was merely something to consider. Of course, practically, this doesn't have to be the case. I already said people tend to use these words interchangeably, and their meaning is partially tied to whatever people believe they mean, but it's still worth pointing out these subtle differences. Another example is when someone substitutes pretty much for virtually or practically when they obviously denote different things. If someone said, "Man, this game is so hard, it's pretty much a Souls-like," the most fitting replacement for pretty much is probably practically, because they're referring to the game's mechanics and practical playstyle and not the story, the developer, etc. Moreover, if someone says this is technically just XYZ, they have to be referring to a technicality. So, if someone says a .html file is technically just a .html file, you'd get what they meant, but they're semantically incorrect. A .html file is literally a .html file. There are no technical distinctions, even inconsequential ones, that render the usage of technically appropriate. However, something like legally, we technically have no evidence because all the evidence we do have is inadmissible is warranted, because the evidence is still evidence in the literal sense, but happens to fall under a legal technicality that renders it technically non-existent in the eyes of the judge and court. Another example is possibly versus probably. Although seemingly the same, possibly means something is a possibility, not a likely or an unlikely one, whereas probably means not only is something a possibility, but it's actually more likely to happen than not. Hence why we also say probably not to designate something we do think is less likely to be true than not.
I said possibly we're going to the game. Do you know what possibly means?
Like probably?
No, probably means there's a good chance that we're going. Possibly means we might not.
In conclusion, every word has its definition and the context in which it is most appropriate. This doesn't mean you should completely ignore connotation, how people perceive a word, but I do believe you should usually prioritize denotation, what a word actually means, which conveniently brings us to Chapter 2. What do you actually mean? This is probably the most important part of this video, since it encompasses not only picking the right word for the situation, but genuinely understanding what that word means in regard to what thoughts you want or need to express. I'll begin with the phrase I see most of the time.
That doesn't make logical sense.
What do you mean? Is the statement you're referring to literally illogical? Does it commit a logical fallacy, or have you simply just not understood it? And if you are saying they're being illogical, are you certain they're even using the same logic as you? You get the point. Usually, what people are referring to if they say your logic makes no sense is someone's rationale or specifically the conclusions they're drawing or their lack of knowledge. They're not legitimately critiquing their logic. For example, if someone says all swans are white because I've only seen white swans, that's an issue in regard to inductive reasoning, not logic. If someone says Trump's tariffs are reasonable because they'll help US companies, their lack of knowledge is what's flawed because they're missing other factors like the US relying on imports for many products like coffee. Otherwise, their logic isn't strictly false. An example of an actual illogical statement is something along the lines of, if B and if B then Q, then not Q, since that's a contradiction. Even logical fallacies don't necessarily mean your logic is now false, as much as they're indicating that what you're saying is probably flawed or weak. Another example of not saying what you mean is insults. What do you mean when you say someone is dumb? Are they below a certain IQ? Are they incapable of speaking intelligibly? This marks a major issue with insults in general. They might make superficial sense or come off as sharp or deserved, but usually they're hollow.
Or many things enough to call them an idiot, but I'm like, you think he's like an idiot? Like, what do you mean? You think he's like not very sharp? You think he can't string a sentence together? You mean like what exactly do you mean? Because when it comes to...
A good way to showcase this is to change the circumstances and notice how the word changes. Imagine person A was not correctly understanding a topic. It's unlikely that you'll call them stupid. But now if they didn't correctly understand the topic and yet vehemently defended that they did, you're now probably more likely to call them stupid or dumb. Why is that? Is it them being adamant in their misunderstanding that made them dumber than the person who's just plain confused? That seems a bit counterintuitive. If someone is just confused about something, they might sometimes be genuinely stupider, so to speak, than the one who's boasted about their wrongful comprehension. In other words, insults are usually lackluster descriptors because they're about your emotions rather than raw fact. They're referring to your subjective interpretation of the situation at hand rather than what's subjectively going on. In conclusion, choose the words which actually describe the thoughts in your head, not the ones which roughly approximate them, or the ones that merely immediately come to mind. Don't say beautiful if you mean attractive. Don't say I love you when you mean I like you. Don't say friend when you really mean acquaintance. Simply put, say what you mean and mean what you say. Chapter 3. Why does this matter? Formal language, especially pedantic wording and the like, tends to be seen as a joke on social media. The guy with the British accent who says inadvertently instead of accidentally, or the friend who says half a dozen instead of 6. But much like many other things in life, a trivialization of the matter does not indicate that said matter warrants trivialization. Each time you speak, you're expressing your thoughts, and this expression runs under two important presumptions. One, that whatever you're saying is in alignment with what you legitimately think, and two, that speaking will better your situation, or at least partially address it if we're speaking generally. Therefore, why not put a little extra effort to make sure those words land right? I'm not just talking about being semantically correct and pedantic about each word. I mean trying to make your words as closely representative of your thoughts as possible. And just because you've managed to live just fine until now using middle grader vocabulary doesn't mean your life can't greatly benefit from more words, more precise words, more complex words, clearer sentences, and sharper expressions. Communication is key to, not exaggeratedly, all of humanity's problems. That's not a subjective observation, it is by virtue of necessity, and it happens to be that language is the primary way by which we communicate. The difference between a divorce and a lifelong marriage could be your ability to express your thoughts properly to your partner. The difference between a country going to war and resulting in millions dead or living in peace could be the president's ability to clearly and carefully communicate his ideas and plans, both to his people and other world leaders. Now, that's all well and good, but I do understand some roadblocks this faces, one of them being different languages. For example, an Arabic speaker has access to a wide variety of words that the English speaker simply has no equivalence to. Or the people you speak to might be limited in the sense that they may not understand what you're saying, or at least not to the fullest extent. These are valid objections, but do not be fooled. You are still not limited. Let not your circumstances dictate how you come across in this world. Sure, it is true that under strenuous circumstances, it is not only practically wise but possibly necessary to adjust your wording and phrasing in order for the receiver to fully or sufficiently understand you. But an occasional simplification does not now mean your entire speech repository is to be deliberately handicapped. To put it succinctly, despite there being instances in which a voluntary dilution of your speech is not only warranted but possibly smart, it doesn't follow that now you ought to ignore improving your language altogether or consider it this towering obstacle that is single-handedly preventing your linguistic improvement. Chapter 4. How can I improve? In our final chapter of this video, my goal is to outline a few possible ways to help you master your language more, thereby becoming more eloquent, more precise with your wording, and thus hopefully more truthful. Step 1. Stop being sheep. For the love of God, be your own thinker. Don't use expressions just because you heard them said a specific way. A good example is,
Yeah, Anthony and Max are both my best friends.
That's just not linguistically correct. The word best designates top one, the best. Just like there can't be two number ones, there can't be two best friends. Even if you genuinely love and appreciate both of those friends to the same exact extent, which is highly unlikely, the word in they're both best friends is still grammatically incorrect. In a similar vein, sometimes you might hear someone say,
My family and well-being are my priorities.
They can't be. Priority comes from the Latin word prior, which means first. You can't have two priorities. The whole point of the word is to designate one thing to rule them all, one priority. I do realize that the plural word priorities does exist and is widely accepted, so I probably wouldn't classify this as incorrect anymore, but in my opinion, it still makes more intuitive sense to use priority to designate something which takes overall precedence instead of diluting its significance by having multiple priorities. These aren't necessarily major mistakes, but the casual acceptance of this linguistic laziness can bleed into serious contexts. Most of these common day mistakes can be avoided if you bother to stop adopting expressions just because you heard them somewhere, and instead analyze them, perhaps scrutinize them. Do they make linguistic sense? Do they convey reality in a proper manner? Step 2. Read, listen more. If you're only exposed to average grammar and regular expressions, those will probably be the exact linguistic assets you use in your day-to-day conversations. Don't be afraid to pick up a book that might house unfamiliar words or complex grammatical structures. You won't really improve beyond your current level if you only tackle what's in your current level. No doy. This doesn't have to be books too. Although they are great companions in this context, it can be a YouTube channel dedicated to philosophy or language. It can be a podcast of such nature too. In other words, wherever you find yourself most comfortable learning more, and more importantly, retaining what it is that you've learned. Step 3. Always ask yourself if what you're saying is what is. What I mean here is to make sure your expressions, hopefully now backed by your own mental rationale and your newly discovered words and general vocabulary, match the reality you're a part of, both ontologically and epistemologically. For instance, when you say, I'll be fine, you don't actually know if you'll be fine or not. You're not a time traveler, but you probably genuinely believe that you will indeed be fine. So just say that. Say you think you'll be fine. You believe you'll be fine. When you say, I know my friend, he would never commit such an act, you can't know such a fact. It presupposes omniscience, which you probably do not have. So instead, say I believe I know my friend enough to think that it's incredibly unlikely that he'd commit such an act. These added words might seem benign, but they add clarity, and why wouldn't you want to be more truthful with what you say? Step 4. Be precise, avoid misinterpretation. I'm positive most of you have been in a situation where your tone was not well understood, perhaps because you were writing each other instead of talking. Some tools at our disposal do make this less of an issue, for example, funnily enough, emojis and emoticons. That being said, I think clear and formal wording can help a lot here too. If someone says, I'm not mad, you can interpret those 4 words a lot of different ways, and depending on the context, they might legitimately all be viable. But had the person said, I'm not mad at you, suddenly your perception changed. You feel like you're in the clear, but there's still a bit of fog around the person being mad at other things. Not only are you now probably better able to address the situation, but you might even be entirely convinced that the person is not mad at you, whereas I'm not mad would have possibly had you fully convinced otherwise. This is one of the reasons why depositions sometimes force you to use precise, maybe even formal language when making your claims and elaborating. The record can't tolerate too much ambiguity when it comes to your words, able to be interpreted many different ways. These stakes are simply too high. Well, why not have the stakes be high for your regular life too? Why see a day-to-day conversation as being low stakes if you being truthful is of utmost importance all the time? Step 5. Don't substitute. This is a short but effective step towards improving linguistically and improving the way you're understood by people. If you feel a certain way about something, but don't quite know the word to describe said way, don't haphazardly rely on a substitution and keep it at that. Let the person you're conversing with know that you're struggling to find a word, and possibly replace the uncertain word by a chain of somewhat confusing but honest expressions. For example, say you felt exasperated, so annoyed beyond casual frustration, but didn't know the word exasperated. Don't settle for I'm mad or I'm frustrated. Say I'm so frustrated that it's like almost an understatement to say that I'm frustrated. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue as much, but at least you're truthful, and the person listening to you probably understands you a heck of a lot more than they would have did had you merely said, I'm mad. I think that's about it for the main advice I would give, at least as a starting point for improving this very important aspect of our lives. I could also add a bonus step, which is be a grammar soldier. Sure, no one likes someone who's constantly correcting our grammatical mistakes, but if someone uses a word incorrectly or makes one of the common mistakes we've outlined earlier, don't be afraid to point out why such a thing might be problematic. To conclude, remember, this isn't about sounding smarter, it's about being more precise, more correct, more astute. Your goal is not to come off as pretentiously pedantic. Rather, it's to come off as on point and sharp. Words matter. They don't necessarily carry intrinsic value, even though that can be argued, but they're also not mere garbled letters there to make do. They carry weight. They carry substance. They convey not just your thoughts and ideas, they convey you. And this is a big deal. I can go as far as to say that having proper expressions and precise speech isn't an optional indulgence, it is a virtue, a necessity which speaks to your character and your adherence to truth. Sometimes it might be the case that I'm sick is just as correct, so to speak, as I'm under the weather. But sometimes you aren't sick or ill of a disease, you're under the weather. And sometimes you're not under the weather or not feeling well, you're actually sick. Next time you want to say, I know that, maybe, just maybe, you ought to say, I believe that. You know? You may not be sold on linguistic pedantry, but I hope I've painted a compelling case for embracing it with this video. Anyways, thank you all for watching. I hope you found this insightful and or interesting, if only a little bit. And as always, stay true and healthy. Or should I say, be true and healthy, since stay presupposes you already are true and healthy, which might not be the case now, is it?